This is a lecture about the greatest of the Anglophone political philosophers, Thomas Hobbes, and more specifically, as Ule has already said, it's about Hobbes's very strong interest in the visual representation of political ideas. So I want to begin by considering the specific cultural context out of which that interest arose, because I don't see how you can understand how it came to be an interest until you get the sense of that context. So, to begin very conventionally, Thomas Hobbes was born in 1588, and he therefore received a type of education absolutely characteristic of the late Renaissance in Europe. At school, you basically learned the Latin language and to speak it to rhetorical effect. Then, if you went to university, you began, it was your whole first year, by studying classical rhetoric in greater depth. After that, you moved on to logic, and then to history and moral philosophy, and you ended up with what they called natural philosophy, that's to say what we would call science. That was exactly the curriculum that Thomas Hobbes followed at the University of Oxford, which he attended as a student between 1604 and 1608. So for my purposes this evening, please note the very strong emphasis on learning the rules of classical rhetoric. That was one of the chief aims of Renaissance education. And if that sounds strange, it was not. It was extremely practical, because almost everyone at university was either going to go on to the law, or in the case of the two universities in England at that time, Oxford and Cambridge, over 90% of students who graduated went into the church. But of course, the law and the church remain professions in which a capacity to speak well in public is absolutely crucial. As the author of the earliest English textbook on rhetoric says, "This is for priests. If you do not read this book, you will preach to the bare walls." So it's a very practical education, and it teaches you an indispensable skill. So what do the rhetoricians tell you you need to know? Well, the first thing they say is that you've got to recognize that in any discussion in which Cicero, the great hero, of course, the rhetoricians, the great theorist of ancient rhetoric, but also the greatest orator of Roman antiquity, he wants you to know about something which he already calls the human sciences, the scientiae humanae. The human sciences, by contrast with the real sciences, of which for him mathematics is the paradigm. In the human sciences, the distinguishing feature is that there are always two sides to any question that can come up for debate. And so in Latin, the argument is always in utramque partem. There are always two sides to the question. There's always going to be dialogue. That's the essence of the humanities. But notice what follows methodologically, which is that it's never going to be possible to persuade people by means of reason alone, because it's just been laid down that there are always going to be good reasons on both sides of the case. So what follows for the art of argument? Well, according to Cicero, what follows is the need to add oratio to ratio. You have to have ratio, reason, of course, because otherwise you're just talking nonsense, but it's never going to be enough. In addition to reason, you must find the means to persuade. That's to say, to use the kind of speech that appeals not to reason, but instead to the emotions. So for the rhetoricians, we are left with a kind of deep play on words in the Latin language and also in the English language, which is the idea of moving someone. Moving, of course, literally means causing them to move, but here the idea is causing them to move to your side of the case, making them take up your position in the argument. So how do you learn to do that? That's what rhetoric teaches. It's how to move the emotions in such a way that someone is, to quote the pun, they're so deeply moved that they move. Okay, they think there are two special answers you've got to get, and Ole already mentioned one is the correct, what they call invention of an argument. Interesting change of meaning, now meaning to make things up, but it used to mean to find something out, finding out through a rapport with your audience what is the best way of moving them. That's to say, how should I organize this? Of course, Cicero says, don't try and do that on the spot. You better have thought about that before. But the idea is the optimum organization. And the textbooks are all about the best way to organize a rhetorical performance that will be persuasive. By the way, it looks very strange to us. It isn't how we would organize an argument at all. They would say, so much the worse for you. The other way that you arouse the emotions of an audience and therefore have a better chance of persuasion is if you speak with so much clarity, and this is a very ancient thought, this is in Aristotle's rhetoric, that the audience comes to see what you want them to understand. And certainly in English, I don't know how this works in Danish, but for us, see means understand. Now I see, meaning now I understand. So understanding is coming to see something which you hadn't seen before. This is what is the result of speaking, to quote Aristotle, with what he calls energia. Energia is the vividness that enables someone to see. But Cicero puts it, I think, more beautifully when he says, you must turn your listeners into spectators. They're not hearing you, they're seeing something. Okay, so then the basic question becomes, how can you manage to speak so vividly that the audience comes to see something, to see your conclusion? Well, of course, that is where classical rhetoric, not Aristotelian rhetoric, but the whole Roman tradition introduces the notion of the figures and tropes of speech. The figures and tropes are, and we use this word in English still, the general word for the figures and tropes is imagery. Notice, images. You see something. I don't just say this person's untrustworthy, I say there's a snake in the grass. Just a metaphor, very hackneyed one, but you see the snake. You think, oh my God, yes, so now I see. I mean, that's a crude example of what they're trying to talk about. But the idea is imagery is the language that makes you see things. But in the era of the Renaissance, that's to say the earliest age of the printed book in the West, a further claim began to be made, and this is completely non-classical. And that is this: surely the best way of getting people to see what you're trying to argue is not to offer them figures of speech, it's to offer them pictures. I mean, that's very obvious. But the insertion of pictures into a book is a technology only of the mid-16th century. And these are, interestingly, called, and they're still called in the English language, figures. So it's the figurative language, but this is a real figure. And now you can, as we also say, figure it out. You're going to be able to see, i.e. understand. Now, of course, that commitment, that theoretical commitment to how, literally get people to see things, that will be more memorable, and it will also move the emotions more. That gives rise to two important changes in the production of printed books. And one is the emergence of perhaps the most popular emblem, apart from religious books, in the first age of the printed book, which is so-called emblem books. These are published from the mid-16th century onwards, first in Italy, then above all in the Netherlands, and then everywhere in Europe, which are books of moral and religious devotion in which the moral lesson is inculcated as follows. On one side of the page is a little homily, usually in verse, and on the other side of the page is the figure, the illustration of the moral. So you read it, and then you look at the picture, and then you see. The other development is the appearance, and this depends on a technology for inserting not just woodcuts, but engravings into books, which is a late 16th century Dutch achievement, the insertion of what were called frontispieces, and are still called frontispieces. That's to say, pictures placed at the beginning of a text in order to explain the argument as clearly as possible. Now, this word frontispiece in 16th century English meant the facade of a building. And so it meant especially the decorated entrance to a building of importance. So to apply the word frontispiece to a book was originally a metaphor. It just means an entrance. But of course, it means the entrance to a book. And so frontispiece is usually began as gateways. Here is an example. I've taken this more or less at random. It doesn't matter really what it is, observations on Caesar's commentaries, but what you are looking at, of course, is a Baroque entrance with the divided pediment in proper Baroque style. But when you cross the threshold, notice the play on words, you are entering the book. And what you see, of course, is the civil war. You see a river, which is the Rubicon, and you see Caesar on one side, and you see Pompey on the other, and you are told this is what the book is going to be about. And notice that it's already an argument on two sides. All right, here's the question for me. Where does Thomas Hobbes stand in this development? Now, the philosophy of Hobbes has usually, and not at all wrongly, been associated with the scientific revolution of the 17th century. Not wrongly, because he was a friend of Galileo's, whom he deeply revered. He was an enemy of Descartes, whom he hated. He was very much part of that intellectual tradition. So that's not a mistake to say that, but it is only a partial truth. Remember Hobbes's education. He's basically a product of a classical rhetorical education. And the important point for me this evening is that he retains some of those earliest humanist allegiances all through his very long intellectual career. He dies still writing at the age of 91. And among these rhetorical and humanist commitments, none is more conspicuous than the fact that he is deeply interested in how you present philosophical ideas visually, how you show rather than tell. Now, Hobbes writes two major treatises on politics, one in Latin, the De Cive of 1642, and his great vernacular masterpiece, the Leviathan, published in 1651. Both these texts are prefaced with elaborate iconographical frontispieces which serve to introduce the argument. And it seems to me that they do indeed provide the best summaries you could, Hobbes's own summaries, of the argument of both these texts. And so it's on these two frontispieces that I want now to concentrate. And I do so as a key to trying to unlock Hobbes's theory of the state. And I shall end by trying to ask us whether or not we should accept this theory of the state. So this is the frontispiece of De Cive, published in Paris in 1642, as you see. This is the work of the French engraver Jean Matthias, who was also the printer of the book, which Hobbes writes in exile from the English Civil War. Well, looking at that, you might think, yeah, but what reason have we to think that Hobbes was involved in that? Very good question, but there is a certainty that he was involved, and here it is. This is the frontispiece of the manuscript of the De Cive, which is still preserved in the collection of Hobbes's patron, the Earl of Devonshire. I mean, of course, not the same Earl, he's a Duke now, but there it is, by his permission, from Chatsworth House, the sketch, probably done by Hobbes himself, but whether or not, notice it's the same design. Now, this is for his patron. He's not going to give his patron a manuscript, the frontispiece of which he does not approve of. So he approves of this. Now, as you see, we now begin to get into a tremendous number of visual metaphors. And the basic metaphor is the normative as well as spatial idea of what is above us and what is below what is above. We look up to people, I hope we don't look down upon people, sort of anti-egalitarian way of thinking, which is deeply embedded in this image. Notice across the entablature is written the word religio, and all human life, you are being told, is under religion. All human life is under religion. And the most important thing to know about religion is that you're going to be judged by those who stand above you. So let's look at it in the two halves, and here is the judgment above. Here I actually have a discovery to report, in case you think this is just journalism, which is that Hobbes has been looking very closely at a celebrated woodcut by Albrecht Dürer from his Passio Christi of 1511. Here's the famous Dürer woodcut. And notice at the bottom, left-hand side, what does it show? Winged angels amongst the congregation of the blessed, a long-haired, naked woman prominent amongst those who've been saved, the congregation being shepherded towards a beam of light, Christ enthroned in heavenly clouds, and a marvelous detail on the right, the damned are being swallowed by Leviathan. Now, all of these features are repeated by Hobbes. Look on the... Of course, you should think of this from God's point of view, and so the left is the right. And of course, that's very important because this is Latin, and the Latin word for left is sinister, but that's the sinister side in the English sense of the word sinister. Well, we've just changed the sense. But so look on what is the right-hand side. The right means good. The right side, and what do you see? You see again angels amongst the congregation of the blessed. You see the long-haired naked woman prominent among those saved. You see they're being shepherded to the beam of sunlight, and you see Christ enthroned. So this is an absolutely standard image of the Last Judgment. In St. Matthew, the separation of the sheep from the goats. Well, there's the upper half. Let's look at the lower half of the frontispiece. Notice the further reference to the domination of our lives by God on the cloth of honor, which gives the title. It also quotes the Vulgate, Proverbs, through me kings reign and the givers of laws discern justice. But what I want to stress here is the centrality of the fundamental rhetorical idea. In politics, there are two sides to the question. If you take politics at its most fundamental, you're going to find two figures opposed to one another, and there is a question to be debated. And what you see is the question that Hobbes believed to be central to political philosophy, which is, our natural condition is freedom. None of us is a slave. Is that the condition in which you would like to live? Or should you live in a condition of subjection to power? Okay, suppose you choose the latter. Subjection to supreme power, Latin word for supreme power, imperium. All right, if you do, you're shown, you can hope that your life will be built on justice. The figure of imperium, notice she's wearing a closed imperial crown, holds the sword of penal justice in her left hand, and notice it's also heavenly justice, it points directly upwards to the Christ figure, and the scales of distributive justice in her right. You also learn that if you submit to imperium, you will gain prosperity. There's a city on the hill which does not have walls, and in the foreground, men with scythes peacefully harvest the fruitful field in the sunshine. Okay, what if you instead think, no, I don't like the idea of being subject to supreme power. Give me the other side of the question. All right. What if you choose libertas? Now, the Renaissance answer is extremely clear. That's the best way of life. Of course, liberty is the best way of life. So here is a wonderful image from Achille Borchi's Emblem Book, 1574, called Symbolic Questions. Notice question, forensic idea, two sides to the argument. There's going to be a question. And the question is, should you choose liberty? Well, of course, look at that. Liberty is helmeted and in classical garb, shown in the company of a lion to show that liberty can be a ruling force. And one of the book tells you this is what Bologna teaches you. And of course, Bologna is a self-governing republic in which the people have not subjected themselves to anyone except themselves. So that's obviously the best way of life. May I show you a more domesticated example? Here is a Ripa. This is perhaps the best-known iconologia. The book is called Iconologia, 1611, first published in Padua, Cesare Ripa, perhaps the best-known of all the emblem books of the Renaissance. Liberty, again in classical garb, She holds a scepter. If you live in a republic, you are the sovereign, no imperium. So you hold the scepter. You are free, but you reign. And she has, of course, the pileus, which is the Roman symbol for taking away servitude, the cap of liberty, which comes, of course, to be central to the iconography of modern revolution, especially the French Revolution. She's also shown in the company of a cat. That I didn't understand, but fortunately there's a little Latin verse on the other side of the page, and it simply says, "Cats love liberty." Now, what does Hobbes say? Hobbes says, liberty is an unwanted and burdensome state. This is iconographically unprecedented. I know of no other Renaissance image of liberty that's remotely like this. They're all like what I've been showing you. You're warned here that if you choose not to submit to sovereign power that will protect you, you'll have to protect yourself. So the hunched figure of liberty, who is, I think you'll agree, looking extremely disturbed, is in a posture of self-defense, bow in her left hand, arrow in her right. No sense that liberty can be a ruling force. It's simply a defensive posture. And notice that she tells us also that we're committed to a dangerous way of life. There's a serene expression on the face of Imperium, but here it's riven with anxiety. And of course, Imperium is classical, which is a symbol for the civilized, of course, Roman classical robes, but here it is primitive undress. No suggestion that the fruits of liberty are going to be prosperity. On the contrary, freedom is savagery. Now, that is the most anti-Renaissance thought that you could have entertained. We've moved in a remarkable way away from that classicizing civilization. Here I've got, if I may say, a further discovery to report, which is that the visual sources for this, which are unknown in Renaissance iconography, come from the very first drawings that were circulating about the life of Native Americans. Actually, Cesare Ripa has one, quite a jolly one here, which you can see Hobbes knows, because the same arrow in the right hand, the same bow in the left hand, the same state of undress. But far more relevant is a remarkable book published in 1590 by a man called Thomas Harriot, and it is called Report on the Newfound Land of Virginia. And Virginia meant that more or less the whole of the eastern seaboard of the United States, as now is, that occupied by North Carolina and modern Virginia, enormous area of Algonquin land. Now, one of Debris' engravings, these engravings, I should say, were made from watercolors, which were commissioned when the British first colonized Virginia in the 1580s. And they sent an artist, John White, to draw some watercolors. They're still to be seen in the British Museum. And Debris, the engraver, worked from these. And one of his slides shows an Algonquin chief. So you see him front and back, and what interests me is the background. He's standing in a fanciful landscape in which 4 hunters with bows and arrows are shooting at a stag. Can you see that at the very back? Yeah, good. Wonderful auditorium, by the way. I mean, this is, for me, I've never had such a good experience with PowerPoint. It'll go wrong shortly, but don't panic. Now, the frontispiece of Hobbes's De Cive reproduces several features of Debris' landscape, but transforms them into, if you recall, something much more sinister. In the background, again, there are 4 hunters. They're similarly armed with bows and arrows, but in this case, they're shooting at fellow human beings who are running for their lives. And one of them stands ready with a club, so that if the arrows miss, he will simply brain them. So that is the life of liberty. Now, I began by saying that the idea of a frontispiece is that it summarizes the book that you are about to read, and this really does. Hobbes is offering you the most anti-Renaissance thought possible. It is, you've been trained to think that a life of liberty and self-government in a republic is the best form of life. I'm telling you that submission to authority, although it's not your intuition, is your interest. And that is indeed the theme of the book. I've done that again because I'm now moving on from the De Cive to the Leviathan. After Hobbes publishes De Cive, he moves back to his scientific interests and spends most of the 1640s debating in Paris with Mersenne and Descartes and the whole group of savants there. But in 1649, the English terminate their civil war by executing the king and abolishing the institution of monarchy in perpetuity. I'm quoting the Act of Parliament. Actually, they only did it for 9 years, but that's what the Act of Parliament says. So Hobbes thinks he has to speak out. And in an extraordinary burst of intellectual energy, between 1649 and 1650, he writes Leviathan. He writes it in 1 year. It is published in early 1651. Now, again, Hobbes offers us an explanatory frontispiece. This is an image which is a very famous one and will be perhaps known to you. This is the British Library's presentation copy. They charged me a terrible amount, but there it is. It's a very beautiful example. This is a folio-sized etching in the original, and it stands opposite the title page. So let me, as with the De Cive image, first of all ask, yes, but do we have any reason to think that Hobbes had anything to do with this? We know he wrote the book, but what about this? Again, good question. But again, there's a remarkably clear answer, which we'll see if we move to this image. This is an earlier version of the frontispiece that Hobbes produced 6 months before publication as a manuscript copy, which he gave to his future monarch, Charles II, who was already, as was Hobbes, living in exile in Paris from the civil wars in England. So this is actually a drawing in ink. It's on vellum. But for me, what's crucial is that it is the same design as the published one. There's a significant difference, which is that the small figures on the torso of this mysterious Colossus are shown here as faces looking out at us, whereas in the published version, we see them as full figures. Otherwise, the two images are basically the same. But then my point is, Hobbes is not going to make a presentation copy of his book to his future monarch if he thinks that this is rubbish. He must approve of this, and he's approved of the same image. The artist of this image was for a long time a subject of dispute. That dispute was finally resolved very recently by the great German art historian Horst Bredekamp in his book on Hobbes's Visuellen Strategien. And Horst has identified the artist as Abrambos, perhaps the best known, most prolific etcher of 17th century France. Also someone whom Hobbes knew extremely well. Noel Malcolm has discovered that they lived almost next door to each other in Paris for 10 years. Now, I want to focus on this image and also on the context in which you've got to place it in order to make any sense of it. So what do I mean in this case by the context? The first context that seems to me amazing, actually, for understanding this image is the context supplied by the earlier image, the De Cive. Because what strikes me most of all, looking at this, is how much Hobbes has repudiated of his earlier political views. Of course, it's true that there is an important, crucial continuity, inasmuch as you see prominently displayed an image of Imperium with the sword of justice again. Of course, they've become differently gendered, haven't they? I mean, here we saw Imperium. Imperium in the Latin language is a neuter noun, but so you can show it as a man or a woman. I mean, it's going to be binary, of course, in that culture, but it's shown here as a woman. I guess because libertas, which is feminine in Latin, and therefore has to be shown as a woman, to give symmetry. But anyway, Imperium is shown by a woman. Although it's very important to Hobbes that the bearer of sovereignty may be a man or a woman, and he has a mild preference for it being a woman, which is quite remarkable in the 17th century. Anyway, there she is. But this figure, who's got a moustache and a beard, I mean, he is intended as a representation of a man, unquestionably male, but no less intended to be the bearer of Imperium. There he is with the sword of justice. Although notice in a very important gesture of this iconography, he is doing something which is called, in English jurisprudence, staying the hand. You don't point the sword, you point it backwards. You're staying the hand. This is an image of mercy. He has the sword, but it's going behind him. But notice he too wears a closed imperial crown. And not only does he brandish the sword of justice, but the sword points at a quotation from the book of Job, which says that that no power over the earth can be compared to him. So he is supreme power. But even here, the changes are extraordinary from the De Cive to the Leviathan. First of all, you would expect the concept of imperium or potestas to be in classical garb. I mean, for example, we're back to ripa. This is authority or power, authority or power. In classical garb, enthroned, of course, carrying a scepter, but completely conventional classicizing image. Notice then the extreme anti-classicism, and there's another classical image of it, of this. Still classical in the De Cive, anti-classical in the Leviathan. Because this figure is not merely not in classical garb, this Colossus is not in any kind of garb because he's not dressed. His body is not that of a natural person. It is a body politic. He's made up of his own subjects. But there's a yet more striking anti-classicism, which is that Hobbes has completely given up the fundamental rhetorical idea, and this is an extremely important moment in Anglophone philosophy, giving up the idea that arguments are on both sides of the case. You cannot think of a serious work of modern Anglophone philosophy written in dialogue form, because it becomes apodictic, and that is what we're getting with Hobbes. In De Cive, two sides to the question. In Hobbes, it's gone. I don't know what we want to say about this. You might say the choice has been made. Or you might also want to say this is telling you there just isn't this choice. It's just clear there has to be submission to supreme power. But far more important, and to me quite remarkable, is the changed place in Hobbes's argument of the role of the Christian religion, and especially the Christian church. Just to remind you, the absolutely standard image of the day of judgment, with all human life being finally judged. What happens to that idea in the Leviathan frontispiece? It's gone. And that's amazing. Indeed, the book of Job says, no one is above him. But of course here, the judgment was above imperium. Here, no one is above him. There is no last judgment. Notice also that in the De Cive image, the figure of imperium has exclusively civil attributes. That's to say, justice is a civil concept. It's not divine justice. It is penal justice and distributive justice. But here, the Colossus holds not just the sword of justice, but what he has in his left hand is a crozier, which signifies an archbishop, the head of the church, the symbol of ecclesiastical power. What you're now being told is there's no such thing as ecclesiastical power. I mean, there may be pastoral care, that may be what churches do, but churches do not have power. All power is civil by definition. So you not only see a revolutionary political theory here, but a revolution within the lifetime of the writer of it. Okay, so that's the relationship, the amazing lack of relationship between the two texts and their frontispieces. But I now want to turn to the much broader visual context of the Leviathan title page in the humanistic genre of frontispieces. And I begin by going to emblematic frontispieces. I'll come to religious frontispieces later. One of the strongest visual frontispieces, which was connected closely with this idea of two sides to the question, is another metaphor, a very important metaphor for these people, the idea that books are deserving of protection and support. Books are precious. The lifeblood of the master spirit, John Milton, the English poet, calls them. Books must be defended. And defenders of the text are people who, and this is another very powerful English image. Again, I would love to know how it works in Danish. Do you speak of standing by someone? I stand by you, meaning I'm your friend, I'll protect you. I'm going to stand by you in times of hardship. There I'm going to be. So here is a wonderful Renaissance frontispiece, which is George Chapman's translation, the first ever English translation of Homer, 1613. Two sides to the question, of course, because this is the Iliad that we're here talking about. And so we have Hector, the leader of the Trojans. Notice he's on the sinister side. And Achilles, the leader of the Greeks, opposite him. But nevertheless, they're both standing by the title. Very deep pun there. And they're standing next to pillars. Do you have this phrase, pillars of strength? They are pillars of strength. They're supporters of the book. They stand by the title. But for an even better example, I can go back to Hobbes. Here is the other great frontispiece of Hobbes's literary works. This is the frontispiece, as you see, to Hobbes's translation, the first ever translation into English of Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, which was also Hobbes's first published work, published in 1629. The engraver here is a man called Robert Cecil, it's marked at the very bottom there, who was the dry point engraver. This is a dry point engraving in England at the time. Notice again, two sides to the question. There is Archidamus, as it says, the king of Sparta, and here is Pericles, the leader of the Greeks. But although they're opposed to each other, they stand by the title. They're protectors of the book, and they stand next to pillars. They are pillars of strength. Well, now, let's ask what happens to that convention in the Leviathan frontispiece. It's still there in a strange way, you might say a vestigial way. But if you look at the bottom, you see where we are in the frontispiece as a whole. I'm now looking just at the bottom. You get two columns. They're not pillars, but they're definitely columns. But what you see here is illustrations not of people supporting the book, but of the deadliest enemies of the Commonwealth, ecclesiastical and civil. And these enemies are what are being portrayed for us here in these two columns. And you're obviously meant to read across, as we do in the West, as well as to read down. So what do you find on the left? Look at the top. Castle, overmighty subject. Coronet, which is actually a marquis's coronet, the highest of the English aristocracy. Castles and coronets are associated with cannon. The cannon is pointing directly against the matter, form, and power of the Commonwealth. Look now, reading across, what matches the fear that the state should rightly have of overmighty subjects? The church. Fear the church. Under the church, parallel with the coronet, is the archbishop's mitre. Underneath that, this is a completely conventional piece of iconography, which you may or may not know. It's a thunderbolt. There's a thunderbolt of excommunication, and that is also directed against the Commonwealth. Now, underneath those three images, again, very important visual metaphor, what upholds this power? Well, on the left, of course, you see massive upholding by swords, sharpened pikes, muskets, cannon as well. Halfway down on the right-hand side, you see also very dangerous and equally pointed and sharp weapons. But these are the weapons of the church, and they are marked syllogism. And then you see the horns, and that says dilemma. So this is the power of argument and the power of armies. And at the bottom, in another very important metaphor, you see the lowest depths. What are the lowest depths to which a commonwealth can sink? Well, the consequence of overmighty subjects having their cannon and their armies is civil war. And there you see the usurpation coming on the field of battle. The usurpation of power by the church leads to the bottom right-hand corner, which is an ecclesiastical court in session, the members of which are wearing the tall birrettas that mark them out as monsignors of the Roman Catholic Church. The challenge to the unity of the state comes not just from its own subjects, but especially from this institution of the church. So, for Hobbes, the question is, what is to be done by the state? Now, another very important visual metaphor. This occurs all over early modern political philosophy, this idea of keeping things under. You can't get rid of these. I mean, you can't hope to get rid of the church. You can't really hope to get rid of the aristocracy. But you can keep them under, keep them down. That's what's happening. They're under the city. They're there. They're pullulating. But the peaceful city is above them. Faction is kept under. And notice now the significance of the sword, which as long as it's kept above the aristocracy, will control them. And the crozier, as long as it's kept above the church, will control it. And they're both in the hands of the Colossus. Okay, the Colossus. I'm going to end with the Colossus because this figure is very enigmatic. Who or what is portrayed here? Well, if you look at the critical literature, which is mainly rubbish, by the way, but if you will be told that this is the sovereign. Now, I have never met the Queen of England, but I bet she's not made up of... I mean, this is not the sovereign, because it's not a natural person at all. So what are we looking at? Well, I think I need to do a little exposition of Hobbes's political philosophy at this moment, because what you need to understand what you're looking at is how does a political association come to be instituted, as Hobbes says, just meaning set up. How does a political association come to be set up? Hobbes says it happens when a multitude of people, separate people, come together and they covenant each with each to agree one with another. I mean, the thought that Rousseau picks up from Hobbes, that it's a covenant of the people with themselves, but to authorize a sovereign. Of course, in Rousseau, they authorize themselves. Hobbes says you can do that. That's called democracy. Not such a good idea, he thinks, because you just get majoritarianism. Suddenly seems a good idea, that thought in England at the moment. Anyway, you authorize a sovereign to represent you, that's to say, to act in your name, with sufficient power to ensure peace. Now, this act of covenanting, we come together, we agree a sovereign, and that will protect us and give us peace. That is a complex act for Hobbes. It's an extremely complex act because it has three components. First, we're a multitude, but when we covenant to authorize someone to be our sovereign, that gives us, if he's authorized, a single will and a single voice, because now the sovereign's will and voice counts as the will and voice of all of us. That's the whole point. We've authorized him to speak and act in our name. But that means that we're no longer a multitude. We have one will and we have one voice. But to have a will and a voice is to be a person. So we're now one person. Secondly, the sovereign is the representative, not of course of the multitude. You can't represent a multitude. They have as many wills as there are people. The sovereign is the representative of the person of the people. But thirdly, Hobbes says, if you have a multitude which is one person represented by a sovereign whose will is their will, you have a third person, a ghostly person, a fictional person. But what you have done is create this person, and its name is the state. And its personal name, it's a person, is Leviathan. So you've created a state, and that's what you are looking at. You are looking at a multitude artificially congregated, as a single body politic by way of having a head of state. It's the head, the natural head. It's a man's head on a fictional body. So what Hobbes is trying to do for us is to make sense of our idea that it's the state that makes laws and declares war and puts you in jail, but the state is only a ghost. How can it do that? Well, of course, the answer to that is a sufficiently robust theory of authorization and representation. But the creation is the state. But I have come to feel, and this is why I want these 5 minutes, that Hobbes has one further and crucial point that he wants to convey to us. And he does so, notice this, you've been noticing it all along, by the fact that the crosier and the sword form two extremely strong diagonal lines. And the impression, I think, that's conveyed is that a further geometrical form is hovering over the rectangular form of the frontispiece as a whole. And so what I decided to do was to draw the triangle outwards, and that's what you get. So I need to ask, notice that if you were to drop the perpendicular, it would go absolutely, I don't know why I didn't do that. It goes absolutely the middle. This is no chance. This is the whole organization of the piece, no less than in Leonardo's Ultima Cena, which is organized, as you know, exactly as two triangles. Here is a triangle organizing the whole space that you're looking at. So what is the iconographical significance of a triangle? Well, twofold, if you're looking at the world from Hobbes' perspective. Every 17th century gazetteer of Europe that I have looked at says Britain is a triangle. I quote Mercator, Historia Mundi, 1635. Britain, the figure of it, is triangular. It runneth forth into three several angles. So Hobbes says, he's written his De Cive, which of course is for the learned of Europe, written in the Latin language. He calls this politics for the English. So it's about the English state, so it's a triangle. But that, I'm making that up. You may or may not think that's right. The crucial significance of triangles is not that, but it is that the triangle is the symbol of God, because God is a Trinity. He is three persons and one substance. Now, as the printing of the Bible begins to be authorized in England in the early 17th century for the first time, Bibles are printed with frontispieces. For the first time, they're printed, and they have frontispieces. And here's one of the very earliest. This is William Whewell's frontispiece for the 1607 printing of the Geneva Bible, even before the English authorized version. Note it, look at the top. What are you looking at? You're looking at a triangle. It's got the tetragrammaton and of Yahweh, God's name in Hebrew, but the crucial dominating image is a triangle. Here is the first printing of the book of, look at the top again, the Book of Common Prayer, 1618. Triangle at the top, tetragrammaton, Yahweh. God is three and God is one. But most significant for my present purposes is Abraham Bosse, whom I've mentioned as the designer of the etching of Leviathan. Here is another etching done by Abraham Bosse in the same year, 1651, and this is the frontispiece for Derincourt's Consolation de l'âme, and look at the top. Again, if you want heavenly light, you have a triangle. Oh, by the way, notice the faces looking outwards, as in the sketched version for Leviathan. So my final question is, what is the fact that the organization is triangular telling us about the idea of the state? You're looking at a representation, an attempted representation, of the very abstract idea of the state. And I think the answer is three things. First of all, think of the state as a god. Now, Hobbes calls it a mortal god. It's only a mortal god. We've made it ourselves. Everything made by humankind is mortal, so it is a mortal god. But, Hobbes says, it is that god under the immortal god to which we owe our peace and security. But secondly, this God, like the real God, is three persons. You see the head of the sovereign, you see the person of the multitude, but you see them together. And what it is to have them together is to have the state. So this is the state, and Hobbes' final thought is, what should your reaction be to the state? In the text he says, your attitude to the state should be one of awe. You must look up to the sovereign power. And of course, that's what the people are doing. Some of them are kneeling on his right hand. Can you see from the back, the right part of it? And they're all looking up to him. Now, some commentators have said, well, this is an act of religious worship. That's a serious mistake. We must never worship the state. We've made it ourselves. This is civil respect. If it was worship, the first thing they would have had to do is something that none of them have even thought of doing, which is take off your hat. They're not in church. This is civil respect that they're showing, but it's thankfulness. Most commentators have said, notice it's only men who are present. Nobody looks very closely. I can see a woman with a baby. I can see lots of children, some of whom are girls. Everyone is there. So the final iconographical message, moving away from this to this, is that it's the duty of states to bring under their protection all of us equally, although it's our duty to view the state with respect for the protection it gives. Thank you very much.